Final class in our 2019 London School of Love. This morning we're going to talk about how we love historically marginalized, oppressed, disenfranchised people. And so Dave, you might want to sit more together as we go on, just for better conversation, perhaps. So when you hear that list of people, historically marginalized, oppressed, disenfranchised, who comes to mind for you when you hear that list? So at your tables, introduce yourselves if you don't know each other already and briefly discuss. Did you find any common themes as you discussed that? Did I give you enough time to discuss? Yes, no, maybe?
I don't think we talked about common themes.
Did you find any? Were there overlaps, or did you all have completely disparate definitions?
What we did was we went to the literature.
Okay.
And they said, a time to confront racism, and they say it's a mix of power, privilege, and prejudice.
Well, sure, that's a definition of racism, but I want to know who do you put in those categories? So may or may not be race.
Yeah, we came up with a whole bunch of people here. Different.
Like who? That's what I'm asking.
Aboriginal
Who?
people.
Aboriginal people.
Slaves.
So anybody who has been forcibly exited from their homeland or forced to work for others?
Right.
All right, so slaves.
It includes people that have lost their place of living, lost their position in society, or their culture is under attack.
Those whose culture is under attack.
People who are forced to work as slaves or indentured servants or
Right. Slaves, indentured servants. Let's make sure everyone can hear since I'm facing that way. Who else?
I think, sometimes those that have mental health issues have been marginalized. And also, it kind of goes in with some of the, the sex trafficking.
So mental health issues, people who end up being trafficked into sex work.
My thoughts with two people of a different sexual orientation.
So gender and sexual minorities is one of the ways to put that.
Yeah.
Right? In the United States, people who are Jewish and Muslim have been historically marginalized. Their voices are rarely, or have not always been brought to the center. People in the United States, people of color,
Yes.
other than white. Sometimes we forget that we also have a race, right? We think, oh, I'm just normal. Uh-oh. That's an interesting thing to say, right?
Well, it depends upon where you're at as to if you are white, black, yellow, green, red, orange, purple, whatever.
Except
you
that
are.
people don't come in purple, right? I'm going to show a video, and we'll get there in a second. But that we normalize our own experience, and in the United States, that means whiteness is normalized.
Not necessarily.
Say more.
White people are under attack too. Black Lives Matter. You don't see T-shirts that say White Lives Matter.
That's because whiteness is normalized.
No,
Because
not
whiteness
necessarily.
is the norm, and
So
blackness is
just
not.
because you don't doesn't mean you're not normalized.
They're not normalized.
Everybody
The
becomes
country is not run by
normalized.
black people. Not
Everybody becomes normalized at some point.
Right, so this topic of conversation is one that gets people hot really fast. I recognize that. And that's okay. My hope is that we will remember to not only strive to love the folks who maybe aren't in the room today, but we will also strive to love the folks who are in the room today, recognizing that we don't all have the same experience. Right? None of us has an identical experience to anyone else in the room. And the different labels that we might attach to ourselves or might have attached to us by others, but that we are aware of and experience, sometimes even the ones that we aren't aware of, those are the ones that can get us the most, have shaped the way we experience the world and the lenses through which we look. No one is objective. It's not humanly possible. right? And so one of the things that I think is super important for us is to own our own opinions and say, this is my experience, and not assume that anyone else has had the same experience. Okay? So can we at least agree to that? We are individuals, and we are individuals in community and communities. We all, I mean, if we were going to draw a Venn diagram of us, we would have a lot of overlaps, but there would be places, like I am the only female pastor in this room. I have experiences because of that none of you know about. Right? You also have experiences in your life that I don't know the first thing about because of who you are. Right? So we have to at least grant each other that. When we think about how do we love well people in historically marginalized, oppressed, and disenfranchised communities, we have to remember that they too are individuals, and we cannot paint them with a broad brush, which is always the temptation, to us and them, and to paint them with a really broad brush, when we don't want to be painted with a brush like that. So we're going to start with that sort of caveat. I put on some of the tables a document that I put there as a resource. It's a social statement of the ELCA that came out a long time ago. It was one of the first ones that came out. And it deals with race, but even though my website that I'm starting with up here is the Montana Racial Equity Project, they define themselves as they want to build equity and justice in Montana across races and ethnicities, but also across faith traditions, across gender and across genders and sexualities, and it's bigger. That's their name, the Montana Racial Equity Project. But you can see it's to work in interrupting racism, bigotry, and prejudice whenever it's encountered. Okay. The Lord be with you. And also with you. Let's pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for creating us with abundant diversity. Lord, help us always to recognize that diversity as a gift and a blessing. Help us to know that when we would draw lines between us based on things we see, that you would have us work to tear those lines down. Lord, help us to approach this conversation with openness, with humility, with grace, and with love. Lord, help us learn how to be uncomfortable and still be okay. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So you'll notice that we don't get a guest speaker today. I was slow in getting in touch with Judith Heilman, who is the executive director of the Montana Racial, I can never get it right, Montana Racial, seriously, Barnett, Equity Project. And she was already booked and wasn't able to be here today. But earlier this winter in January, I took one of their workshops, which they'll be hosting again in Bozeman in May. It was really powerful. It was really uncomfortable. I commend it to you. And it's of high enough quality that it counts as like official continuing ed hours for teachers and other professionals. So, I mean, it's a serious workshop. It's coming up in May. I want to say it's 17th, I want to say 18th, something like that, right in there on a Saturday, I think. 18th, thank you. Mm-hmm. If it is the Saturday, it might be the Friday, which would be the 17th. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this is because I think we tend to think that racism doesn't happen here. And if we think that, and sometimes it's easy enough for me to move through the world pretty comfortably, and I forget. And then Megan Vincent, who unfortunately is not able to be with us this morning because she's off doing some work stuff. Megan, who you may know, is a white American of largely Scandinavian heritage, who is the vice president of our congregation this year. Her youngest child is Mila, is, as Megan sometimes puts it, Norwegian and Haitian. So she's Norwegian. But Ismaila When you look at Ismaila, you can tell she's not white. Megan also is raising 2 of her ex-husband's older children who are even less white than Ismaila. And I had a text message conversation with Megan yesterday confirming that it was going to be all good on her for me. I'm like, is it okay if I share part of some of these stories? She said, yeah, I wish I could be there. So earlier this year, 2019, a little boy in Ismaila's first grade recess with Ismaila at a public school in Bozeman didn't want to play with her and didn't want to touch her because she's black. Okay? That's this year here. First grader didn't come up with that on his own. Someone taught him that. Right? Ismaila is moving through the world in Bozeman in ways you and I, those of us who are white, don't. Megan's older children, this is something that I hadn't thought about, but Megan texted me, she's like, I could fill hours of stories. Like how the older 2, people always think they are older than they are. Because a lot of us living in Bozeman especially, don't have a lot of opportunities to have close friendships or even to know well a lot of people of color. And that results, at least for Biori and for Carrie G, the experience of being othered and not understood because of how they look. It's real, and it happens. Judith Heileman, the executive director of the Montana Racial Equity Project, had story after story of things that have happened here to her. Horrific things that people say. And the thing is, a lot of the time, we are blind. I am blind. I am blind to it. And I think because I don't say it, that makes me a good person, and so to be a racist makes you a bad person, and so there's no way in hell I am a racist. Except that I am. Except that I am. When we step outside of the race box, and yes, and one of the things also that was really interesting to me was when Judith Heileman said that sometimes white people are super well-meaning, and they say, well, I don't see color. I'm colorblind. And she said, don't be colorblind, she said, because then you are completely cutting off a ton of my experience. Acknowledge me, know that I am black, but then know you are white, right? And I was like, oh, that kind of messed with some of my assumptions in the ways I thought I was doing well by moving through the world with the way I was trying to. So I have a couple of videos, because I am not an expert except in doing it wrong, as I will tell you that in a lot of ways you probably are too. And so a couple are ones that were shown. I gotta find it. I know they're linked here. Videos. So the first one that I'm going to show is this woman named Joy who tells about a trip to the grocery store and her experience at the store. What do you think?
Incredibly awkward, because I've had to ask for ID. The 2 forms of it. I mean, the cashier was wrong not to,
If it's the policy, and you ask everyone.
Right.
Not just the black woman.
I've heard these kind of things in many settings, and all the white people always have trouble with the most explaining why they couldn't do that. And the fear of stepping up and saying something. I've had that fear myself on buses in other areas. It's not easy.
It's not.
But you have to try. Because this kind of thing is just, it's so dehumanizing. A lot of people like to think that minorities don't get anywhere because they're lazy or stupid or whatever. That dehumanizing is the main reason why minorities never get anywhere. He and I are asked to have separate checks every time we go out to dinner, separate checks. And we're married.
Yeah,
every time I dance.
It's minor compared to this. It's
Every
minor,
time.
minor.
I never thought about
But
that.
here especially, every time.
Yeah, Roxanne?
When we were in Senegal visiting Annie and Pat, our father and son-in-law, we were leaving Dakar and going up to San Louis, and we would keep getting stopped by the police. And it was a very, it was so interesting to be in that shoe where, you know, never had to worry about that before. And I would go, is this what you guys go through all the time? And each time we had to do it, there was, you know, more questions, and they would radio ahead. And it finally, we ended it by, you know, our driver saying, you know, we gotta pay some money to let you guys get through. And so, yeah, you know, we don't realize that. You know, and again, it was, I am very, as scary and as awkward, I am very glad I had that experience. It was just a very short time. But,
So then I have another video that's a little bit longer, and it's one that's shared by the United Methodist General, I'll tell you the title, their board of something, something, something. Anyway, so this is on the religion and race page of the United Methodist Church. The ELCA pages on racial reconciliation and anti-racism training aren't as robust as this one. We've got a lot of documents, but not a video. Robin D'Angelo is an affiliate associate professor now at the University of Washington, and wrote a book that has been somewhat controversial, but also it feels like a smack in the face. I've just read excerpts of it. This video is one of the pieces that has helped me remember that just as much as I might, looking at someone else, recognize, oh, that's an Asian American person, or oh, that's a person of Filipino descent, or whatever, that, and however I might categorize people of color, that I am white, and whiteness means something, all right? Similarly, I move through the world as a straight cis woman. And that means something. She talks about race in particular, but we can hopefully do some of the work of extrapolating to other ways, that other characteristics of who we are and how that affects our experience in the world. So, what do you think?
Pretty accurate.
On some levels, you know, on some of it, she just, you know, it happens, but yeah, you know, I don't know how it is up where y'all are, but you know, where we are, the only privilege you get is from showing up for work, and you know, I do tons of work that no Mexicans or black people just come in the door and walk around and go away. They're like, hell no, I ain't doing none of that.
Sure.
You know? And they say, oh, well, we do the jobs that white people don't want to do. And that's not true.
Sometimes it's true.
Well,
When crops go unpicked because nobody will go and pick them, and so things
see,
rot
that
in
doesn't
fields.
happen in the Midwest where I live.
Okay,
It
well,
might happen in California.
It does happen
but
some
you
places.
know,
But I think one of the things that is helpful for me when I think about the phrase white privilege, because it's a hard one to kind of get my head around. I mean, I tend to think more often of like socioeconomic privilege. You know, like I never worried where dinner was going to come from. I always knew there was going to be dinner on the table, right? But white privilege, that's not the same thing as white privilege. White privilege doesn't mean that you were never hungry. It doesn't mean that finding a job isn't hard. It doesn't mean your life is easy. But it means that whatever your problems and hardships have been, they haven't been caused by the color of your skin. Right? When you walk into a store, security doesn't start tailing you because you're white. Right? Whereas in some places, that's exactly what happens when people of color walk into the store. Right? And so that's what it's talking about. That's all that white privilege means, is that no matter your life can be miserable, but it's not miserable because of the color of your skin. Right? Roxanne?
Well, I listened to a podcast, and there was a black woman talking about being on an airplane, Yeah, and a white gentleman is sitting next to her. And they start a conversation, and they saw that they had some music in common that they both liked. And then he said something to her, and she kind of like, whoa, wait a minute, and that's kind of, and he said, so what I just said is racist? And she said, yes. And so then he said, so what other things have I said to you in our conversation that I was totally unaware of? So that was where they got deeper. And, but again, it doesn't happen that often.
It doesn't happen
And
that
he was
often.
willing to,
Yeah, and some of the people of color, like Judith at Montana Racial Equity Project, and so there were a handful of other people of color in that workshop, and one of the things they said was, white people, educate yourselves. Don't rely on us to help you learn how to get it, right? Which is why I'm showing I am not an expert in this, except to know that I'm not an expert in this, and that I can stick my foot in it as well as anybody, right? It's gonna be time for worship in a minute, but so to think about, so as people who live in Bozeman, which I think we can all agree is not an overly diverse town when it comes to a variety of ethnicities and skin colors and languages, right? We're Montana, and if it weren't for the university, we'd be even less diverse. I mean, the university bumps up our diversity factor hardcore. So what are some things, what are some easy things we can do? How do we maybe sometimes occasionally stick a wrench in that cycle of racism? And some of the easy ones, the obvious ones, are when people tell jokes. I don't laugh, and I say, I don't get it. I've been taught this, right? So somebody tells a joke, a racist joke, and I don't laugh. I'm like, I don't understand. Why is that funny? Explain that to me. I know, I'm almost done. I learned how to do that also a little bit because, believe it or not, I used to be really blonder than Ms. Jetty over there. I was a good math and science student in high school, right? But people would tell blonde jokes. And it's always blonde women jokes, right? They never tell jokes about blonde men. Right? So there's no small amount of misogyny involved. But people would tell a blonde joke about a dumb blonde, and I'd be like, I don't get it. Why is that funny? And because they all defined rightly I did better on the physics test than they did. I was not, But so whether it's gender or sexual orientation or race or geography or, because I have progressive friends who tell redneck jokes. Why is that funny? It's a good way to interrupt it and make them explain. There's incredible power in that. The other piece that I learned at the workshop to try to be a helpful bystander. So the first video, Joy, who was at the grocery store, and her sister-in-law, who presented white, thank you, was able to interrupt it and say, why is this happening? If you are somewhere and someone is being harassed for speaking another language or for appearing to be of a different faith tradition, whatever it is, don't engage the person who's harassing them, engage the person who's being harassed, and go up and say, hey, are you okay? Can I help you? Sometimes, especially if it looks like it could turn violent, to go up and pretend you know that person. It's so good to see you. I've been wondering how you are. And it can deflect some of that, which is, because being a bystander is a hard thing to
If
do.
you don't want to do that, just stand there and watch.
Stand there and watch.
If there's someone in authority who's going after, like we talked about earlier, just stand there and watch.
Yeah. And I was also told, don't automatically call 911 because it's not uncommon for law enforcement in some situations to take the easy route, which would be to identify with the person who looks like them, who speaks the same language that they speak, and you can actually make the situation worse by doing that, unless the person who is under fire asks you to do that. So, thanks for coming. The conversation is not over. The ELCA, as much as we would like to, as much as we say we are welcoming and inclusive and diverse, we are the second whitest Christian denomination in the United States.
I thought it was the first.
I recently was told it was the second, but we could.
There's
we have not become radically more diverse. We have work to do.